Well, tonight should be just pretty simple. What we're going to do is read 4 stories about Thor, and then reread them with a running commentary. And after we've commented on each of them and given a summary of each of them, we'll have a little look at the general theme of all of the Thor stories. And it could be very short. It could be like 75 minutes like last time. I just don't know. So in any case, it shouldn't be horribly long. And since we're only doing 4, it won't be a matter of 4 Thor in 7 years. And if it is, don't be Thor about it. Sometimes there will be many commentaries and sometimes there will be few. The first one that we're going to look at is the longest one, and it's Thor's journey to Utgard. And I'll read through it very quickly and then come back to it. Outside of Asgard, there were other powers who possessed considerable strength and wisdom and who had to be respected by the gods. This is shown by the tale of how Thor himself was once outwitted and found his great might of little avail. He set out one day with Loki for a companion. When they stopped at a farm for food, Thor provided himself by slaughtering the goats which drew him so that they could be cooked and eaten. After the meal, he spread out the bones on the goat skins, raised his hammer Mjolnir, and blessed them, whereupon the goats stood up fully restored. The farmer's son, however, had unthinkingly broken one of the leg bones for marrow, and the goat to which it belonged was left lame. Thor's anger was terrible to see, and the farmer, in his panic, offered his 2 children, Thialfi and Roskva, to be his servants. These 4 then went into the land of the giants. They traveled all day through a mighty forest, and at night came to a huge building with a wide opening across one side. They groped their way in and lay down for the night. But before day came, there was a great earthquake, and the building shook. In terror, they moved down the hall and found an opening leading into a passage on the right. Here they sat terrified while Thor guarded the entrance with his hammer, and all night long they could hear a great roaring noise outside. When it grew light, they ventured out and found a huge giant lying not far away. They realized that the roaring was caused by his snores. Thor buckled on his belt of strength, but at that moment the giant rose to his feet, and so enormous was he that for once Thor was not prepared to swing his hammer. The giant said his name was Skrymir, Big Fellow, and he picked up what they had taken to be a building, but now saw to be his glove, with the thumb sticking out on the right to make the side passage in which they had sheltered. The giant said they could journey together and suggested that they should put all their provisions in one bag which he carried. His great strides took him on ahead, and that evening they found him waiting under an oak. He lay down for a nap while they turned to prepare supper. But when Thor tried to undo the bag, he could not unfasten the strap, strive as he would. At last, in a fury, he struck Skrymir on the head with his hammer. But the giant only opened his eyes and asked mildly if a leaf had fallen on his head. In the end, they lay down without supper, and once more the noise of Skrymir's snores filled their ears. Thor struck with his hammer a second time, but the only response from Skrymir was to ask whether an acorn had fallen on him. At dawn, when the giants still slept, Thor struck a third time, and this blow was so mighty that the hammer sank in up to the handle. The giant then sat up and remarked that a bird seemed to have dropped something on him from the tree above. Then he took leave of him, warning Thor to be on his best behavior when he reached the hall of Utgard, where he assured them there would be plenty of fellows bigger even than himself. He rode off through the wood, and to their great relief they saw him no more. They reached Utgard at midday and found it no smaller than they had been led to believe. It was indeed so huge that they were able to get in by squeezing between the bars of the mighty gate. In the hall was the king Utgard Loki. When at last he noticed his puny visitors, he was not very complimentary in his welcome, but he inquired whether they had any special gifts which they could display before the company. Then followed a series of trials of strength at which Thor and his companions did not acquit themselves as well as might have been expected. First, Loki tried to race with a man called Logi. He was utterly outstripped, for though he rapidly... First, Loki tried a race at eating with a man called Logi. He was utterly outstripped, for though he rapidly devoured all the meat he was given, Logi swallowed the bones and the trough as well. Next, Thialfi, who was a swift runner, ran races with a lad called Hugi. But Hugi was able to reach the end of the course and come back to meet him every time. Then Thor made a trial of his strength in a drinking contest. Thor was given a huge horn, which he expected to empty easily, but after 3 attempts to do so, he found that the liquid had only dropped a little below the rim. Next, the king suggested that he should try the feat of lifting the cat from the floor. A great gray cat jumped down in front of him. Thor grasped it around the middle and exerted all his strength, but was only able to raise one of its paws off the ground. Finally, Utgard Loki called in his old foster mother to wrestle with Thor. She seemed a decrepit old woman, but Thor, with all his power, could not get her off her feet. When, however, she grasped hold of him, he was forced down on one knee before the king stopped the conflict. The discomfited god and his companions were then given splendid hospitality and stayed there that night. Next morning, Utgard Loki himself escorted them to the gate, and once they were safely outside, he revealed the truth to them. Thor and his comrades had been deceived by cunning magic, altering the appearance of things. The 3 blows struck at Skrymir, who was in fact Utgard Loki himself, had fallen to the earth, and Thor's hammer had left 3 mighty pits in the hill which the giant had interposed between himself and the angry god. The bag, which could not be undone, had been fastened by iron bands. As for the contests in the hall, they had not been what they seemed. Loki's opponent was Logi, fire, which consumes all things more swiftly than any man or god. Thialfi had raced against Hugi, thought, swifter than any man in its flight. The horn offered to Thor had its tip in the ocean, and the great draughts he had drunk had lowered the sea level to ebb tide. The cat was in truth the ancient monster, the world serpent, so that all were terrified when Thor's strength proved great enough to raise it a little way from the depths of the sea. His opponent in the wrestling was no other than Eli, old age, who can overcome the strongest. When he learned how he had been tricked, Thor in his rage swung his hammer, intending to destroy the stronghold, but even as he did so, it vanished from sight, and they were alone on the plain. Nice little story. Let's start going through it. We'll get 2 sentences, and then we'll have commentary. This is shown by the tale of how Thor himself was outwitted and found his great might of little avail. He set out one day with Loki for a companion. All we want to remember here is that Loki is part Titan. This is the same that we saw in the Greek mythology, that Kronos, Saturn, was a Titan, but he hobnobbed with the gods. On the other hand, we're finding that Thor is a god that spends a lot of time with the frost giants, who are themselves Titans. So it's not surprising that Loki would be chosen to go on a journey to visit the frost giants. Now, the Thor, as we've noted all along in Greek and even in Hindu mythology, the demiurge, be it Shiv or Thor or Zeus, lives in the lowest of the transcendental realms. That is, in the realm of ideational thought, where we form abstract ideas, the most important of which is the idea of self. However, the first transcendent plane above that is the ideas of form, and that is the realm of Kronos. And what we're talking about here is Thor going to the land of the frost giants means an attempt to transcend his own selfhood to something higher, not even to the realms of pure spirit, but just a little higher within the realms of ideation. Now, Thor is the same as Zeus, which means all bright, and this is the spiritual light of divine being. And so we said last time that Thor was a divinity, or the nature of divinity that represents light, and the light of selfhood, and especially the light of knowing. On the other hand, Loki as well as Loj, the 2 words converge actually in northern European mythology. Loki and Loj are both a fire god. And so they talk about the more active fire that produces light. And the only point I want to make here, that's the only reason for this little side trip, is that this is indeed an esoteric story. Because if we look at astrology, Saturn is a planet of cold. But when we look at Logi or Loki, in both cases they are planets of fire. And this is to say that the esoteric is the opposite of the exoteric. All of the planets take on special opposite meanings when you look at them in an esoteric sense. For example, Venus is usually considered in the outer sense, it's considered a planet of cowardice. It's considered a sissy planet. But on the other hand, esoterically, Venus represents the highest degree of courage, because only love can get you past the dweller on the threshold. And so the planets have an opposite meaning, and I just took this as a time to bring in one of my favorite of all poems, talking about fire and water. It's from Jalaluddin Rumi. I don't know if I can read this very well. It's difficult. If you are a friend of God, fire is your water. You should wish to have 100,000 sets of moth wings so you could burn them away one set a night. The moth sees the light and goes into the fire. You should see fire and go towards the light. Fire is what of God is consuming. Water, world protecting. Somehow each gives the appearance of the other. To those eyes you have now, what looks like water burns. What looks like fire is a great relief to be inside. Very, very lovely poem. One of my favorite of all poems. All right, so we'll go back to the story and read the paragraph. We actually read two paragraphs after that. When they stopped at a farm for food, Thor provided himself by slaughtering the goats which drew him. Remember, he has this cart, which is probably cubical in shape, that is drawn by goats, so that they could be cooked and eaten. After the meal, he spread out the bones on the goat skins, raised his hammer, Mjolnir, and blessed them, whereupon the goats stood up, fully restored to life. The farmer's son had, however, unthinkingly broke one of the bones for marrow, and the goat to which it belonged was left lame. Thor's anger was terrible to see, and the farmer in his panic offered him his two children, Thialfi and Roskva, to be his servants. Outwardly, it would seem that the gods feast on illusion, because every time he wants to eat, he slaughters his goats all over again and eats them and then restores them. And it would seem that the goats were illusionary. In a way, this is true, because hunger or appetite is a quality that is of the phenomenal and not of the transcendental. In the transcendental, the divine is self-sufficient. It lives unto itself and it lives in the spirit. We know that the demiurge of the Jews in the Bible says, I am that I am. This is another manifestation of a principle that we've talked about over again and again and again in these talks. The whole idea of bringing the goats back to life, and the whole idea of the illusory nature of forms in the material world, which are easily transformable by the divine, is a principle that we have called playing make-believe for keeps. That is to say, we, along with other divine beings, project ourselves into the unknown. We project our dream into the unknown, and we materialize the spirit in the stuff, in the matter of the unknown. But in that action, we know that we're projecting a dream, but we do it in such a way that we're playing it for keeps, as though it were real, and something about that allows us to penetrate the form into the unknown, into the matter of which the form is manifest, and in that we take part of the unknown and make it known. And so there is something in all of this that this is a very big principle. Like in some ways, the world seems very illusionary. But if we play it for keeps, and if we make our relationship to the dream of the world an all-out sacrifice to the unknown, that is the thing that gives us the perspective to pass through and bring it in as part of the known. The theme of the broken bone is a very common theme in Northern European mythology and in folk tales. Very often there is, like I can remember, the folk tale of the 12 brothers who some witch turns into geese, and their sister has to spin something for them, spin them clothes, and within such and such a time, and when they wear them, if she has completed it within time, they will be transformed back into handsome young men again. And she completes all but the arm of one of the pieces of clothing, and so the 12 are restored, but one still has a goose wing. It's an interesting theme, and it's interesting in that it relates to the inversion of the Hermetic axiom. Instead of saying as above, so below, in this case it goes so below as above, meaning to say what happens in the phenomenal worlds in this realm of imperfection affects what happens in the spirit. Now, we've talked about the dream, and we've mentioned the dream before a number of times over quite a few years, that God has this dream and manifests it, and it becomes the creation, and through that creation, God becomes more of God, even though God is everything. I don't know how to say it in any other way. All of the things of pure spirit are mysterious. They have great mystery about them. Our part in that is that the dream is so perfect that we in microcosm follow the same procedure. We have a dream and we project it into the worlds, which are the macrocosmic dream of God, and then we glean things out of that. Now, the problem is, it's a Hamlet-like situation. Like, we're often afraid to manifest our dream because we know it's never going to come out the way we want it to. This is the way it is with art. It's never exactly as beautiful as the dream is inwardly. If we don't manifest it, eventually we lose our spiritual strength and we become diffident people. If we take the dream and manifest it and work at it as hard as we can and take our art project and carry it out the fulfillment. It may not be perfect, but something happens in the process that after the creative act is over, the dream is even more beautiful than it was before the creative activity. And if we didn't manifest it, it would sort of wither away and become an illusionary daydream or something like that, where everything is perfect in the dream, but in the world everything isn't perfect. So this is the process of knowing the unknown, or having the soul food of self-becoming. Now, in the story here, and the life that we are in, it's not just a matter of our dream or of our life not matching up to the dream that we had before we incarnated. It's not just a matter of imperfection. Our part as humans in the great divine plan is not just imperfect, but there's kind of a, we're not just unfaithful to the dream, but we have intentionally deviated from the dream. We have made our dream be asynchronous and adharmonious with the divine dream. And this is what is called sin. It is divine discord. And so you might say it is a kind of redoubled imperfection. It's not only imperfect, but it actually works against the whole purpose of the greater dream. So there's a redoubled imperfection. So from our point of view, from our perspective, where we, for all of our vaingloriousness, are very weak and very feeble, the discord that results when our petty intentional miscreations, our divine disobedience, when they try to resonate with the greater resonance of the big spiritual reality, what happens is that there is a clash. And this clash we see as the wrath of the gods. So like in the story here where there is the broken bone and the farmer's son has broken it, and they see Zeus or Thor angry, this is not saying that Thor is angry. The gods don't get angry. The divine beings don't have that quality about them. But the dissonance, our discord, from our human perspective, what is a beautiful, swelling, creative concord that makes all of creation go, when our little petty things get projected against that and reverberate against it and bounce off of it, it seems like divine anger. Obviously, the only cure for this is the sacrifice of personal ends. Because only when we give up our very personal, selfish ways can we again reestablish concord with the greater view of things and be together with them. So, in this case, what has to be sacrificed are the most dear and intimate things of all, the things we possess or want to possess more than anything, our children. So in any case, we have the two divine beings, Loki and Thor, going to Utgard, and the two children of the farmer. And so we have a company of four going into the realm of the great spiritual giants, the realm of the three. So it is a matter, so you can look at the whole play as saying like this is the four going into the three, rather than an incarnatory thing where you have the three, like the threefold spirit going into the four and assuming form. All right. Let's read the next couple paragraphs here. These four then went on into the land of the giants. They traveled all day through a mighty forest, and at night they came to a huge building with a wide opening across one side. They groped their way in and lay down for the night, but before day came there was a great earthquake, and the building shook. In terror they moved down the hall and found an opening leading in a passage to the right. Here they sat terrified while Thor guarded the entrance with his hammer, and all night long they could hear a great roaring noise outside. When it grew light, they ventured out and found a huge giant lying not far away. They realized that the roaring was caused by his snores. Thor buckled on his belt of strength, but at that moment the giant rose to his feet and was so enormous that for once Thor was not prepared to swing his hammer. The giant said his name was Skrymir, big fellow, and he picked up what they had taken to be a building, but now saw to be his glove, with the thumb sticking out on the right to make the side passage they had sheltered in. The giant said they could journey together, suggested that they should put their provisions into one bag which he carried. His great strides took him on ahead, and that evening they found him waiting under an oak. He lay down for a nap while they turned to prepare the supper. When Thor tried to undo the bag, he could not unfasten the strap, strive as he would. At last, in a fury, he struck Skrymir on the head with his hammer, but the giant only opened his eyes and asked mildly if a leaf had fallen on his head. In the end, they lay down without supper, and once more the noise of Skrymir's snores filled their ears. Thor struck with his hammer a second time, but the only response from Skrymir was to ask whether an acorn had fallen on him. At dawn, when the giant still slept, Thor struck a third time, and this was so mighty a blow that the hammer sank in up to the handle. The giant then sat up and remarked that a bird seemed to have dropped something on him from the tree above. Then he took leave of him, warning Thor to be on his best behavior when he reached the hall of Utgard, where he assured them there were plenty of fellows bigger even than himself. He rode off through the wood, and to their great relief they saw him no more. So we have 3 blows in the night. The counting of the 3, 1, 2, 3, and off we go. The section has a quality of, it introduces a whole principle of hierarchy that pervades the entirety of our soul and probably of the cosmos. It is a principle of perspective and of proportion. Right now we're located pretty deep, pretty far down on the vertical axis of creation. We're pretty down near the base of the Yggdrasil tree. Our perspective is material. It's imperfect. And as we have seen, it's even inverted and selfishly deviant. Very personally, we have set ourselves against things. Now what we see in this part of the story is that our viewpoint and our outlook is also very small. Whether we take Thor to mean self, or whether we take Thor to represent the demiurge, the third of the threefold spirit, in either case, this is small before what it is placed next to. We can see that there are consequences to having a limited perspective and a limited proportion First of all, we see things, or we can see in the story, that we are seeing things from a more material perspective than a spiritual perspective. We see things only as external objects, as things, as matter, as stuff. Because of our insecurity in this materialism, and this insecurity leads to a self-protective kind of need, we look for shelter. And with our really small sense of proportion, we see, as a great hall, we see a glove. So it's kind of it's kind of ludicrous, our outlook. For the same reason that we see a goat only as a source of food, and that not only that, but it's divinely provided for us. I'm trying to say that our perspective is so self-oriented that when we look at a goat, all we see is food. And food could be destroyed even if it was given to us in plenty for free. Now, it's folly to not see a goat as a goat. I'm not saying that we should become follyful and not see a goat as a goat. And its milk at least is good food for us. But in its own right, it has its own sufficiency in its being. It does have something of its own quasi-independent, you know what I'm saying? We no longer look at animals as sacred beings. We don't have a reverence. We don't care for things as they exist in themselves. We have no respect for life and for things that live. It's a terrible outlook that we have. A goat is a goat, yes, and it provides food, yes, but it is something more. In a way, every goat is a representative of Capricorn, which we know is a composite of a very large divine cosmic idea. And even though the goat may be eating up our laundry, it still represents that divine idea. And that whole living being that is Capricorn has a purpose, and has a purpose in working through the goats. And it has its right to its own being, to its own purpose, just as much as we do. And it also has a divine purpose just as much as we do. So just think of what we would see if we treated all the world as holy. If we treated every goat, or every cat, or every weed, or to even walk on the grass or on the pebbles as a holy experience. If we could maintain that higher consciousness, we couldn't do it all the time because we wouldn't do the things that we need to do in this world, but what a wonderful perspective we would have. What a wonderful sense of proportion we would have. And sometimes we can see that because even in those little things of not respecting goats or weeds or something like that, it has very large-scale consequences. Our petty little attitudes relative to great cosmic ideas sometimes are, they cause tragedies, worldwide tragedies for us. we even project our insecurity. We not only destroy every goat that gets in our way or milk it for all it's worth, or you're not going to bite on puns tonight, or misbreed them for our own way. We even project our own will onto the divine in our cosmic insecurity for attacks. Skrymir, even though Skrymir has only been helpful. So the consequence of this is also evident in the story. It just goes to show that it just shows us if we attack the divine from our puny human way, from our puny phenomenal existence, it makes us all the weaker. And all of those attacks on the giant produce nothing. Because we're not cooperating, we're not working with the divine plan. What we do is we just weaken ourselves and it gets us nothing. All right, let's go back and read a few more paragraphs. They reached Utgard at midday and found it no smaller than they had been led to believe. It was indeed so huge that they were able to get in by squeezing between the bars of the mighty gate. In the hall was the king Utgard Loki. When at last he noticed his puny visitors, when at last he noticed them, he knew they were there all the while, but just let them wait before they were seen. Yes. He was not very complimentary in his welcome. He inquired whether they had any special gifts which they could display before the company. Public ridicule, the strongest force of humiliation that you can do. Really gonna zap them. Then followed a series of trials of strength at which Thor and his companions did not acquit themselves as well as might have been expected. First, Loki tried a race at eating with a man called Logi, and was outstripped, for though he rapidly devoured all of the meat he was given, Logi swallowed the bones and the trough as well. Next, the Alfie, who was a swift runner, ran races with a lad called Hugi. But Hugi was able to reach the end of the course and come back to meet him every time. Then Thor made trial of his strength in a drinking contest. Thor was given a huge horn, which he expected to empty easily, but after 3 attempts to do so, he found that the liquid had only dropped a little below the rim. Next, the king suggested that he should try the feat of lifting the cat up from the floor. A great cat jumped down in front of him, and Thor grasped it around the middle and exerted all his strength, but was only able to raise one of its paws off the ground. Finally, Utgard Loki called his old foster mother to wrestle with Thor. She seemed a decrepit old woman, but Thor, with all his power, could not get her off her feet. When, however, she grasped hold of him, he was forced down on one knee before the king stopped the conflict. The king was wise, didn't completely humiliate him and completely break his spirit, but went far enough to let him know. Though our attitude in our lower self is inverted and perverted, we experience it every day that way, it still fulfills its function, even though it is skewed. Boy, I've lost myself in my notes here. This is really something. The nature of the transcendent is refulgent spirit. It's always giving itself out. It's always filling time with spirit. The nature of the phenomenal in which we in our lower nature exist is vacuous. It's always sucking matter and forms into space. Like space has to always be filled. In human beings, in the phenomenal realms, this vacuous sucking is twofold. In one direction, the sucking is perception. We are always drawing in the world to us. We can't get enough of beauty. We can't get enough of sensation. We can't get enough of external experience, and we suck it all into ourselves. Then there's the great denouement, which is worth at least 20 minutes. Not really. So looking the other direction then, the sucking of the phenomenal is asking questions. In some ways, it is our questioning and our need for meaning that draws out the Spirit as much as the Spirit is resplendent in its giving out of itself. The first sucking quality we know as a curiosity. The second we know as the basis of our inner dialogue. Our lower self always questions, our higher self always gives answers. The consequence of this twofold sucking, or this twofold function of questioning and curiosity, in us is different because of our renegade nature, because of our independence, because of our personalizing. It sees the positive attitude of spirit as a challenge, rather than just an expression of the divine which we could accept. Because we are insecure, we look at it as a challenge to us. And we see it as a trial or as a competition. And we make the spiritual life much harder for ourselves by not accepting the nature of the Spirit and allowing it to flow through us. In our renegade being, we challenge it and we fight against it. But because the very nature of the phenomenal realms in which we live is limitation, it must obviously fail. There's no possible way that the puny personality can in any way try to challenge the divine and struggle with the divine. You know, the divine has infinite purpose. And it turns out, just like in the story, all of our attempts appear ineffective. You can't square the circle. The square represents the materialization, the objectification, and you can't do it. You can't take the whole of spirit and make it into a thing. It's always greater than that, and it's a mathematical impossibility, it's a logical impossibility, and it's a spiritual impossibility that the personality can at any time ever have any power over the divine. All right, we're almost done. That's all. I don't want to get into all the contests. I'll just mention on a side that they have to do with life and death opposites, just as we saw in Thor's struggle last week with the Midgard serpent. The last time we met, 2 weeks ago, that it was between life and death opposites, and that's a theme that's going to come up again toward the end of the Northern European hierarchy when we talk about the destruction of the world. And all right, the discomfited god and his companions were then given splendid hospitality and stayed there that night. Next morning, Utgard Loki escorted them to the gate, and once they were safely outside, he revealed the truth to them. They're coming back to their own senses again because they're in their own realm and they feel at home and they think they can see things clearly. And the spiritual experience, until we bring it down into the material world, doesn't have any real meaning. We can't relate to it because it is such an awing kind of thing. Thor and his comrades had been deceived by cunning magic, altering the appearance of things. The 3 blows struck at Skrymir, who was in fact Utgard Loki himself. We never see God as God is, had fallen onto the earth, and Thor's hammer had left 3 mighty pits in the earth. They ricocheted just as you might expect. You can't challenge heaven. It goes back to earth. The giant had interposed between himself and the angry god. The bag, which could not be undone, had been fastened by iron bands. As for the contests in the hall, they had not been what they seemed. Loki's opponent was fire, so you're fighting a lower fire with a higher fire, which consumes all things more swiftly than man or god. The Alfie had raced against Hugi, thought, swifter than any man in its flight. The horn offered to Thor had its tip in the ocean, and the great draughts he had drunk had lowered the sea level down to the ebb tide. The cat was in truth the ancient monster, the world serpent, so that all were terrified when Thor's strength proved great enough to raise it a little way from the depths of the sea. His opponent in the wrestling was no other than Ili, old age, who can overcome the strongest. When he learned how he had been tricked, Thor in his rage swung his hammer, intending to destroy the stronghold, but even as he did so, it vanished from sight, and they were alone on the plain. Try to, quickest way, not being able to recognize the divine for being what it is, you try to destroy it. It's a quick way to lose your spiritual experience right there. You're not, you look at something as an enemy, which is probably your greatest friend. Because the Northern Europeans had Odin or Wotan as their principal divinity, it's not surprising that repetition would be part of their mythology and part of the message of the stories. And the repetition that takes place in the Thor stories is redundancy. And redundancy, as we said, is like in astrology, the more redundancy there is, the stronger it becomes. You take any astrological principle and you have a redundant force comes in, it becomes more than twice as strong. It becomes many times stronger. So again, when we unwind the story, we find that reiterates several themes that we've seen all along. Our phenomenal and sinful impotence, which is quite clear. We can't stand against the divine. Our preoccupation with the illusory as an exclusive reality. We do tend to think that even though we're playing for keeps, we should still remember the spirit when we're playing for keeps and not think that, not get into the material world in such a way that we believe it is the ultimate reality. Personification of the realm, or personification of the macrocosm in the microcosm, the drinking of the water, and the cat being the personification of the Midgard, and the trying to interact with the whole medium. So this is a principle that comes up again and again. And when we get to the general unwinding for tonight, we'll come back to it. We see the power of the transcendental, cosmic perspective and proportion as magical. These were seen as acts of magic when they really weren't acts of magic. They were probably straightforward acts of creation, and they always were that way. Things seem magical to us only because we don't understand them, only because we don't truly get into the spiritual realms as truly spiritual. If we remember right from the beginning, the whole of Ginnungagap was called the place of great magic, rather than being a place of great inspiration and of spiritual truth, which is, not at all magical in the sense, meaning magic deceiving. Finally, we see again the isolation and exile that we have in our materialism, and we'll come back to this all later. So let's very quickly go to the second story and go through it. Let's see. I didn't read. Let's read it all through. I think we'll only have to do it once. Or let's do it twice. The second story is called Thor's Duel. Another tale is that of the giant Hrungnir's duel with Thor. Odin and Hrungnir had a wager together, each insisting that he had the finer horse. Odin galloped off on Sleipnir, and Hrungnir after him on his horse Goldmane. And Hrungnir inadvertently found himself inside the realm of the gods before he drew rein. The Aesir followed him to drink. The Aesir allowed him to drink from Thor's great beakers, and he grew boastful, declaring he was going to sink Asgard into the sea and carry off Freya and Sif. Thor at this point came in, furiously demanding why a giant was sitting drinking among them, but Hrungnir claimed safe conduct and challenged Thor to a duel. Here we go, another challenge again, another duel, same principles coming again and again. For this duel, the giants made a clay man called Mistcalf to support Hrungnir. Hrungnir himself had a sharp, three-cornered heart of stone and a stone head, and he was armed with a stone shield and a whetstone. Thor came out with Thialfi to meet him, and Thialfi told the giant he had better stand on his shield in case Thor attacked him from below. Then Thor bore down on Hrungnir with thunder and lightning and hurled his hammer at him, while the giant threw his whetstone. The weapons met in midair, and the whetstone was shattered, but one piece lodged in Thor's forehead. The hammer went on to strike Hrungnir's skull and break it to pieces. Meanwhile, Thialfi had dealt with the clay figure without much difficulty. The only problem was caused by Hrungnir falling on top of Thor, for no one could move his great leg off of the god until Thor's little son Magni came up and pushed it away. Magni received the horse Goldmane as a reward. Aesirus tried to sing spells to get the piece of whetstone out of Thor's head, but he began to tell her how he had once carried her husband, Arvandil, in a basket out of giant land when one toe of Orvandil had frozen. He had flung it up into the sky to become the star called Orvandil's toe. She was so interested that the spell never was finished, and so the stone still remains in Thor's head. Interesting story. It's really amazing to me. I don't know what's more amazing to me is the meanings behind the stories that come out when I ponder on them, or the stories themselves, the form that those meanings take in order to be made manifest. This was a difficult... What? I'm not sure. So let's quickly go through. It's only 2 paragraphs. Another tale is that of the giant Hrungnir's duel with Thor. Odin and Hrungnir had wagered together, each insisting he had the finer horse. Odin galloped off on Sleipnir, and Hrungnir after him on his horse Goldmane, and Hrungnir inadvertently found himself inside the realm of the gods before he drew rein. The Aesir allowed him to drink from Thor's great beakers, and he grew boastful, declaring he was going to sink Asgard into the sea and carry off Freya and Sif. Thor at this point came in, furiously demanding why a giant was sitting drinking among them, but Hrungnir claimed safe conduct and challenged Thor to a duel. This was a very, very hard story for me to really get anything out of. The thing about it is, and it's something that relates to all mythology and all folklore and all stories like this that comes out again and again, and that is the all-important viewpoint principle. What viewpoint you look from determines what your perspective is going to be. And the viewpoint is skewed according to your perspective, especially if you're looking from the phenomenal realms, the realms where we are in, the material worlds, rather than the purely spiritual worlds. We're likely in our limitation to see things in a skewed way. This is why, for example, if you read in the Bible, it says that God is a jealous and angry God. That is seen as jealousy and angry from people who are themselves very twisted and sick. We have the anger and we have the jealousy, and we project our emotions onto the divine being, and the divine being, I think, is nothing but love and wisdom and pouring out all sorts of good things in a positive way. The race between the god and the titan is an interesting thing to look at. The race itself is a matter of perspective. If we think of a line of consciousness, if we're singing a song or writing a song, the melody represents a line of consciousness. Or if we're playing a game of chess, the kind of attack or the kind of counterattack that we use represents a line of consciousness. It's sort of like a sweep. The whole creation is like that also. That in the primordial atom, that is the cosmic creative formula with its periods of time and its globes of space and its revolutions of consciousness. The revolutions of consciousness in the creation are lines of thought. They're part of a great creative direction. We saw that last time when we saw the very direct, straight line of consciousness between Thor and the Midgard serpent. Now, if you are seeing a line of consciousness between two realms, it looks like a race. On one hand, if you're looking at it from the bottom side up, or from the phenomenal in the spirit, it looks like the mind is racing along. If you're looking from the downside, from the top side down, it looks like the direction of consciousness is the spirit that is sweeping along in a creative impulse, which from the underside looks like a line of thought. And so the race is really not a race at all. You know what I'm trying to say? It is looking at a sweep of consciousness. You can look at your whole life that way, or you can look at the times that you live in, or you can look at the 90s in that way, or you can look at the so-called selfish 80s. From one point of view, they look like one thing. From another point of view, they look like something altogether different. And so, like that's just a principle that we're trying to represent here. We saw this a lot last year when we talked about the castration of Uranus, and we came back to it again this year when we talked about the slaying of Ymir. We talked about the sub-celestial arch, which is the realm of pure spirit, the life spirit, dipping down as close to the realm of ideas as it can, and from the realm of ideas seemed as darkness, whereas the realm of light spirit seemed as pure light. And this is why the sickle that was used to castrate Uranus, which represented the noetic noeric, or represented the life spirit, was seen as gray. It was seen as a mixture between the pure light and the relative darkness that was the world of ideas. So it's I don't know how to say this. Any period of time, or any arc of time, because, you know, this is a principle that we find throughout all of mythology. We hear about arcs, Noah's Ark, and such like that. They're all associated with semicircles, arches like the sub-celestial arch. If you want it, you can put a mast and some sails on it, but it is the arc as the arc of time. And if you look at it from above, it's different than if you look at it from below. And that point of view is like what the race between the god and the giant is like. When one realm impinges on another realm, it's always significant. In this case, the impingement means that the giant came into the realm of the divine, of the gods, the realm of the Aesir, rather than being in the giant land. We see this all the time. When one realm impinges on another, when the mind impinges too strongly on the desire nature, we have repression. When the desire nature impinges too strongly on the mind, we have perversion of thought for selfish ends. So it's always important when one realm impinges on another. It's especially important when the transcendental hinges on the phenomenal. Where there is a much greater differential, because we're talking again right at the center of the hourglass. Eula's got me looking at all of those yantras now. I see the hourglass within is that the Sri Lanka yantra that has all of those hourglasses in the middle? Right in the center is where the spirit impinges on the phenomenal or where the phenomenal impinges on the spirit. And that's a very, very important place. Again, the giant starts boasting, but it isn't boasting at all. It's really natural self-expression. The spirit is expressing itself, and we see it as boasting. It's a kind of insecurity, a personal insecurity that we have in our separation. There is, in the meeting, like if we take a higher meeting or impingement between the will and the imagination, the struggle of one drawing out the other or the one impressing the other is a very important struggle where the emanation reaches that which assumes the emanation. In any case, we have a very vigorous interaction between the spiritual realms and phenomenal realms, which is very important. We're getting awfully long, so I'm going to go faster. For this duel, the giants made a clay man called Mistcalf to support Hrungnir. Hrungnir himself had a sharp, three-cornered heart of stone, a stone head, and he was armed with a stone shield and a whetstone. Thor came out with Thialfi to meet him, and Thialfi told the giant he had better stand on his shield in case Thor attacked him from below. Then Thor bore down on Hrungnir with thunder and lightning and hurled his hammer at him while the giant threw his whetstone. The weapons met in mid-air, and the whetstone was shattered, but one piece lodged in Thor's forehead. The hammer went on to strike Hrungnir's skull and break it into pieces. Meanwhile, Thialfi had dealt with the clay figure without much difficulty. The only problem was caused by Hrungnir falling on top of Thor, blah, blah, blah. I don't think we need to go into any more. We can remember the rest of the story. From here on in, the story becomes all the more difficult for me. I had a really hard time with it. The Mistcalf is completely baffling to me. Especially since it seems to have almost no part in the battle at all. Or at least the Alfie does away with it rather quickly. And so I think this may be because the story is probably just a fragment out of something much bigger. And sometimes you have to realize that when you're dealing with myths and stories, we only have a small part of them, and breaks in continuity sometimes or understanding of things, you'd have to know a bigger picture of things or have to have heard more of the story. When I ponder it inwardly, it represents to me something like a decoy. It's like saying that our energies get decoyed into thinking that the thing is the reality rather than the representative of a greater reality. And I tend to, like this is a similar theme if you remember in the case of the Exodus. The Jews built a golden calf rather than accept the new way, which was not at all a way of idolatry. They built their own golden calf. And it came to represent a falling back into old ways, and it represented idolatry. And in this case, I think, rather than the perspective being that the people produced the decoy to decoy themselves, the divine put an object before them and it appeared as a decoy. The story is really, really very fascinating in that it gets to the whole idea of shields and belts and whetstones, all of the things that, all of the shapes that are taken by divine beings in space are always circular and spherical. Whether they're flying saucer-like, like the solar system with a big ball and a disk in which all of the planets are, or which we could call an elliptical belt, it's like saying that the strength and manifestation of divine beings is always found in that perfect spherical, circular kind of consciousness. And that seems to be the manifest quality. The three-cornered heart this time, instead of the three-cornered hat, represents that this is a made being, sort of in the sense of the mafia. All spiritual beings that are manifest spiritual beings have a threefoldness about them. They have that attributive completion. And in this case, the heart of the being of the giant is threefold, three-cornered, and it's stone. And stone in this case, I believe, represents the same thing as Christ, as the rock. It is a density of consciousness that is so thick that it appears like crystal and stone. Again, the weapons meet mid-air. This has two important meanings to me. One being that this is again one plane impinging on another. And where they meet, it's right in between. And this is a really important thing with anything having to do with telepathy or with theurgy. And in this case, I mean by theurgy a inward conscious connection with a higher intelligence. If you try to project your thoughts onto someone else's aura, or if you try to project your thoughts right through to someone else, this is a very unwholesome way of communicating. You are violating their space, as the term goes now. You're violating the integrity of their being to force something onto them. The best communication is sympathetic resonance. When there is a similarity in vibration, when there is a common quality that one brings out within itself and the other one can relate to it within itself, and then they harmonize, and then from within each experiences the same thing. So that it's enough to think a truth with the other person in mind to telepathize. You don't have to project the thought to the other person or penetrate. In this case, Thor does make a breakthrough, and it turns out to be a destructive breakthrough. So there is a penetration. Thor, obviously, from this case, represents, with his hammer, going into the realm of the giant, or into the head of the giant. This represents the difference between concentration and meditation. Concentration penetrates. Meditation harmonizes or resonates with. The fragment of the stone is a theme that is much too big for us to go into now. It's one that is found in many, many, many places, the most famous being the stone out of which the Grail cup was carved, which which fell out of the crown of an archangel in the battle with the Lucifer. It's enough to say that part of that divine, rock-solid, crystal-packed spirituality resides in us. A small fragment of that. It's right in our forehead, so to speak. It's this, it's the jewel in the lotus. It is, it's a common symbol of seership for all of them. The giant falling on Thor is exactly what you would expect. Once you have overcome and you have made your breakthrough and you have that piece of the divine within you, the first thing that occurs is enormous responsibility. But what does he do? He passes it on to his son. Meaning to say that once you have raised to one level and have a higher responsibility, you can't handle it all yourself. You have to delegate some of that, and some of your new higher consciousness has to be passed on to other beings. And what also happens afterwards is, when they try to charm the stone out of him, what happens is he charms the charmer. And the stone remains there. And that's precisely what happens. Once we have that little bit of the divine awakened in us, once the crystal begins to glow in us, what happens in us is utterly fascinating. And it's no surprising, and that's not surprising at all to find that that even the seeress would be enchanted by his storytelling. But even the storytelling is another redundancy. I'm trying to keep from being too long in all of this, but it is getting awfully long anyway. I looked in all of my books, and I have some very good books on star lore and such, and I could not find out what star it is that is Arun Vandil's toll. There is a similar star name in the Pleiades in Sanskrit. The words are almost identical, but it's a little bit too much to say. It would make sense, because if the center of the whole business, of the center of the entirety of all creation, is in the direction of the Pleiades, that would really make sense. It's interesting to note, though, that there is, again, a reciprocity. I don't know how to say this. The Norse myths have all these vertical reciprocities. On one hand, a stone comes down and sticks in Thor's head, and on the other hand, he throws a frozen toe up into heaven. And it's like showing again whether it is internal, whether it is a completion of the cycle of the creative energy in ourself that goes down, and then we consciously bring it back up the spine to enlighten the stone, or whether it is us falling from the spiritual realms down into matter and then projecting ourselves back up again. It's that head-to-toe match. Right here is where the head is, and here's where the toe is. It's a completing of the cycle. And there are all those principles of reciprocity, so that there is a complete vertical cycle that is in head-to-toe matches. All right. Yeah, it's crazy, the astrology that is in all of these things. It's interesting to note also that if in a human being, if you become too vertical and too polarized, and you put too much into your head, very often that's associated with club-footedness. In the same life that you would have a really powerful head consciousness and a very weak lower club-footedness. I learned that from Rudolf Steiner. It's really a great insight. Though I like it in the story of the toll much better. All right. We have another little story here. It's called Thor's Visit to Geirrod. Another tale about Thor. This is only one paragraph long, and the notes are only about 5 lines long, so it means it will only be 75 minutes. Thor's Visit to Geirrod. Another tale about Thor tells of his expedition to the realm of Geirrod. Loki had again been flying in Freya's feather shape. He was captured in the hall of Geirrod by the giant himself. Geirrod recognized the hawk by its eyes and knew it to be Loki. So he shut him up and starved him for 3 months until he promised to bring Thor to the hall without his hammer or belt of strength. Loki succeeded in this, but on the way Thor was warned of his danger by a friendly giantess who lent him her magic staff, another belt, and iron gloves. First, Thor was nearly drowned in the river Vermir, where Geirrod's daughter stood astride the stream making it swell, which is kind of profane, until he struck her with a huge rock and then climbed out with the aid of a rowan tree. There are all kinds of symbols in here that we're not going to touch. Even though we have a British member in the class here, I'm not going to talk about the rowan tree. Huh? Because I didn't have time to go into it. Yeah. The rowan is a form of Juneberry. It's fairly close to a pear tree, sometimes called a checkerberry, I believe. And it is a sacred tree in a lot of lore, but that's neither here nor there. Until he struck her with a huge rock and then climbed out with the aid of a rowan tree. Then he entered Geirrod's hall and sat down on a seat, but at once felt himself being raised to the roof. So he forced the seat down with the aid of his magic staff, and so broke the backs of Geirrod's 2 daughters who had been pushing up his chair. Then he went up to Geirrod, who flung a ball of hot iron at him. Thor caught it with his iron gloves, and while Geirrod ducked behind the pillar, while Geirrod ducked behind the pillar, he hurled it through the pillar and giant together, so Thor went back unscathed to Asgard. That's the story. These sound like kids' comics books, don't they? With all of the battles and violence and such like that. Only instead of being senseless violence, this is very senseful violence, filled with all kinds of meaning. We're not going to say very much about it. We're going to remember some of the ideas. Here we again have the redundancy of a vertical reciprocity, going up, the ups and downs. Gods and titans seem to ascend or descend into each other's realms, and we have these cycles of going down and going back up. In this case, Loki, who is a grounded titan, you might say, flies up into the giant's realm, and Thor is lifted up or elevated in the chair. In the other story, we had a mist calf and a stone fragment descending and toes ascending and all of such like this. And the reciprocity is here in the form of a ball being interpreted. We could take this is one of those stories that we could take the science theme and see this as meteors and things like that, but it wouldn't be very wise to do that. So we'll just hold a little bit of the story in mind and go on to the last story and look at it, and then have a few general remarks to make and call it a night. Just about about to run out of tape. The last story is the theft of Thor's hammer. The story goes that one day Thor discovered that his hammer had been stolen. He called on Loki to find out what had become of it. Loki borrowed Freya's falcon shape and went out to search. And he found at last the giant Thrym had hidden the hammer deep down in the earth. Aha, this thing goes down into the earth. And refused to return it to the gods unless he were given Freya as his wife. This message caused great consternation in Asgard and sent Freya into such a rage that she shattered her famous necklace as she panted with fury. But Heimdall suggested a plan to get the hammer back without risk to Freya. Thor was to wrap himself in a bridal veil and journey into Jotunheim in Freya's place, accompanied by Loki, disguised as the bride's handmaid. At first, Thor thought such a disguise beneath his dignity. It always happens. Before we're going to get to somewhere spiritual, we always have our dignity challenged. We always have to get our hands dirty and do the humbling thing, the seemingly undignified thing. But Loki reminded him tartly that without the hammer there was no hope for Asgard. All right. Thunder and lightning rent the mountain as they drove off in Thor's chariot, and when they entered Jotunheim, they received an enthusiastic welcome. At the feast that night, all was nearly discovered because of the bride's voracious appetite. But Loki quickly explained that the reason why Freya was able to eat an ox and ate salmon what? was because her ardent longings for the wedding had kept her fasting for 8 nights. Again, when Thrym tried to kiss the bride, he was terrified by a glimpse of the god's terrible burning eyes beneath the veil. But Loki explained that Freya had no sleep for 8 nights, so intense was her longing for Jotunheim. Thor's ordeal came to an end when the hammer was at last brought in to hallow the bridal couple and laid in the lap of the bride. Once he had his hands upon it, it was not long before Thrym and all the wedding party were slain, and Thor returned with Loki in triumph to Asgard. They're cute, clever little stories on their own. There's another theme I'm just going to mention. What? No, you have to be pithy in writing. I don't know if I could be that succinct. The theme that we're not going to go into, but I want to mention it as a preview for potential coming attractions, is the theme of things that are stolen, lost, forgotten, etc. It's much, much, much too long for tonight, but I do want to do it. I want to do a sub-series on the origin of evil, sin, ignorance, suffering, and such like that. And that is a theme that would run through all of those kinds of talks. Suffice it to say that the Titans wanted something that the gods had as their own. In this case, it was objectified as first the hammer, but ultimately as Freya. Love personified, love objectified. Again, Loki is the interloper, capable of going back to the realm of the giants. He rises again on the wings of love, and he goes there in the form of Freya's hawk. And we again have that whole idea of something rising. If you'll notice in all of these stories, what brings the giants down into the realm of the gods or down into the realm of humans is always some kind of selfishness or greed. What causes the ascension, at least if it's a successful ascension, into the higher divine realms is love or some kind of sacrifice. Those elements seem to be necessary. We have to desire, and we have to desire experience. We have to desire things in order to be brought down for new hands-on experience. But we have to sacrifice, and we have to sacrifice for the sake of love to rise out of this. We can now see from this story the redundancy of these cycles going up and down, that there are propelling forces. All right. That, again, when Thor is successful, it is always with a feminine help. Remember the last one where he was raised up? He was raised up by two women who raised him up. It's always, there's something very beatific, whether it is Freya's hawk, or whether it is the giantess who gives him her own belt and another pair of gloves and staffs. And in some ways he would be raised up too high, which would actually kill him. We're talking about the previous story a little bit now. But it is a very important principle that descent into the lower realms is based on things. But it is the higher feminine, the loving, protecting, the giving quality of the divine that is uplifting. Okay, the object of desire at first is Thor's hammer. And this represents the basic will to exist. This is not will of the divine spirit only. This is the basic power of will that is in the third attribute of the triune spirit that is us. And that general will to live is what infuses our thought forms before we come back to incarnation. And that whole process of materializing is represented by the cross. And that's what Thor's hammer is a cross. The power of materialization is always represented. That's what the cross is an emblem of. It's our responsibility to the material world. It's the crux issue. If the square represents the four phenomenal realms, and it represents the whole trial and measurement and test of the phenomenal realms, the center of that, the crux of it all, is in the cross. And so the hammer represents the power of manifestation. And it is that will, when it is handled, the general will to live, that when it is handled by Thor, that allows it through its blessing. It's a blessing of the cross that causes the goats to come back to life again. And it's when it's done in that benign sense that it has that whole quality. So the manifestation is truly a fabrication. You know, that we, from Zeus on down, that is, from the human spirit on down, we are fabricators. The true creators are the higher spiritual beings, and that fabrication is done through the power of the cross, which does the materialization. The rest of the story is fun, and it's not necessarily especially significant, at least all of the part about eating oxen and things like that, keep people's interest, going. It again shows, like the difference between our boorish ways relative to the higher kind of refinement or transcendental consciousness. But I want to now take just a few minutes, a very few minutes, and look at some of the general themes of the stories about Thor, and look at those general themes as to how they relate to the principles of hierarchy as we're looking on them. There seem to be, beside the vertical cycles going up and down and the planes interacting with each other, there seem to be three general things. Thor interacts a lot with giants, where Odin or Wotan sometimes interacted with them, but usually interacted with humans and other gods. Thor interacts with giants. All of his associations involve vital struggle. And the third thing in common to them is the struggles are often over power, but usually over things coveted by the gods, including Thor himself. They want to have Thor. What? Yes. Yes. Now it's important to remember in all of this that Thor represents the third attribute of the threefold spirit in macrocosm and microcosm. That is the human spirit or the Holy Spirit. And that involves selfhood within an individual like ourselves, even though we're usually not self-conscious. It's not like baptisms by the Holy Spirit are everyday occurrences for us. That also, what is represented by Thor is the higher, abstract, or ideational mind. Also, what is represented by the third attribute of the threefold spirit is the knowing, functional, demiurgic consciousness, which is often indicated by Neptunian magic. And what is represented by Thor is also the general spiritual will that is centered in the selfhood of the threefold spirit. All right. Are that many pages? 3 more pages. Jerry says I'm tired tonight. Oh. Now to understand, things get weird from here on in. To understand the whole general themes of the stories of Thor, it seems to be wise to try to understand why Darwin and Darwinism has such a strong, powerful influence on our worldview. You all looks at me grimacing. Now, we could easily dismiss Darwin and Darwinism as a Luciferic, materialistic counterfeit, because the forces of the adversary always work as counterfeits. This is a symbol of eternity, the snake swallowing its tail. This is a symbol of the gap in eternity, so that the snake doesn't swallow its tail and you can fall out the hole. You know what I'm trying to say? So that if you see someone wearing a ring where a snake is swallowing its tail, that means something very different than if they're wearing a ring where the snake does not swallow its tail. They have highly different meanings. And it would be easy to say of Darwinism that it's just a materialistic counterfeit that keeps us from understanding the true spiritual evolution which we find in the mysteries. And that it is intended to keep us in materialistic darkness and in our self-assertiveness, in our vain self-assertiveness, thinking we're the height of evolution. And you might say that it is extremely Luciferic and that it tries to keep us competing with each other. And if we continue to compete with each other in self-assertive desire and outbursts thereof, that means we're more harvestable by the Lucifers. Now, there is some truth in that view, but it's not enough. If we remember that history, including intellectual history, is an extension of karma, is an extension of the divine plan. And if we remember that competition is an important fact of nature, it's not exclusive. The Luciferic part is to look at evolution in strictly competitive terms, when there is just as much or more in cooperation as in symbiosis, or in bees helping flowers and flowers helping bees. Those are cooperative things. They're not competitive. And if we remember not only that competition is important, and not only that history, including intellectual history, is part of the divine plan, but that the gods participate in nature, even in very competitive nature. They participate as group spirits. And they participate in human intellectual nature and evolution as cultural spirits or as race spirits. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to say that the fascination and importance of Darwinism in the world is not just the work of the devil. It would be Philistine to say so. It would probably be even wiser if we said that there is great truth in Darwinism, and it is important in its influence in getting us to work harder, because we are kind of encumbered in the material world, and we tend to become lethargic by materialism, phlegmatic in it. And the urgency of keeping a pace spiritually is very important. So it is important that we put in as much as we can. However, even though Darwinism has that quality of if we want to get somewhere, we have to work really hard, we do have to avoid the Luciferic extremism. We don't want to get caught up in egoistic, desireful competition. If we do that, we take it all personally. And then we get blindly tied up in nature. And we become bound in competition, almost like in feuds, as in Northern Ireland, or between the Hatfields and the Coys, or something like that. We become very earthbound. In the struggle of nature, the plants and the animals play for keeps. Given the chance, a mistletoe will suck a tree dry. And an animal will kill another animal. It's a life and death thing. But it isn't personal. It isn't play either, because animals know play, and even polar bears, which are some of the most fierce of all animals, will play with dogs. And they will not kill them, even though they could kill them with one swat. So it is a for keeps thing, and it is not play, and it's not wasteful. I think the attitude to avoid the extremism of timidity or extreme attachment is to think of it like a drama, where we have to play our role, and we have to play it well, because if we don't, the play will be unsuccessful, and nobody else will be able to play their role well. If we overplay the role and ham it up, we destroy the play. If we're unconvincing and don't give ourselves to the role, that makes for a weak play also. So we have to give ourselves to the play, and we have to do so impersonally and without extremism. The extremism in one case would be like the hamming it up, which would be very Luciferic. On the other hand, we have to avoid the satanic, which some call the Ahrimanic temptation, to be too coolly objective about our role and to be almost pedantic about it, coldly impersonal and executing, like with efficiency. So we have to play for keeps, and we have to give ourselves in such a way that we don't lose ourselves, but that we do lose ourselves in such a way that we find ourselves. And we have to keep from being timorous and non-committal. And the result of it is we come out the other end clean and pure. Animals do not sin when they kill each other or when they are killed. They come out the other end clean. Now, we've been looking all along at these myths tonight, at the little stories. We've been seeing that perspective and point of view play a large part. And let's try to do that now. Let's try to do it from a transcendental point of view. the Thor's eye view, or Thor's stone view, and look at it so below as above. We know from studying astrology that one of the effects of egoism and self-satisfaction is laziness. That the signs that are most inclined toward egoism are the signs that are most inclined toward laziness. You pamper yourself, take care of yourself. Leo probably being the best example. So we can see in this that if we are ego involved and we get encumbered in matter and we have an infatuation with it so that we get possessive and sensualistic and self-gratifying, the encumbrance in matter from so below as above leads to a spiritual torpor or a spiritual lethargy. And all of the experience doesn't become good experience because it becomes tainted by the encumbrance. It gets all that extra sheen of personal gratification, which is no food for the spirit. And then there is a spiritual torpor. The spiritual torpor also has other forms that it takes. For example, there is a concept called self-unfolding, such that the whole idea of spiritual awakening is as easy as a flower unfolding its petal. One by one they unfold, or they all unfold together, depending on whether you're a rosy fellow or a lily person. But that's another side topic. There is a great and useful truth in Darwinism in that the competition keeps us moving. But there is also a truth in spiritual Darwinism. I don't mean to say that we have to have divine fighting and that spiritual becoming is not partially unfolding. I'm not saying those things at all. But what these stories bring home, especially for a humanity that was coming to the extremities of materialism that we are now living, the importance of a kind of spiritual Darwinism is brought through. When in reality, the sun does not become the sun effortlessly. It gives, and it gives all of itself. It expands itself to the solar system to the end of its power. Now, the way that is expressed is not in grunting desire the way we expend ourselves, and there is an easy way, the way of the Spirit, but it is an act of will, a giving, a very sacrificial kind of will. So what we're saying is that self-becoming is not a passive matter. It can be easy, as in my yoke is easy. It's not a muscle-straining desire either. But there is a willingness to live, a willingness to life. And if we do that, if we live in that will with full integrity and we give ourselves to the world, there is where we become. We don't have to fight higher beings. Though some spiritual schools, very high spiritual schools, such as the Gnostics, did fight the spiritual beings. They studied astrology so they knew what the gods were up to so that they could fight against it. Some people do indeed require that kind of struggle. But we must realize that the being of divine beings, by its very nature, would cower us. The gods don't just pull back. They don't evacuate time for us to become. Somehow we must find in the fullness of our own being the desire to give. And that's the only way we can penetrate that rock-solid nature of the spiritual beings. And they are rock-solid. They can be an encouragement and an inspiration, just like it's an encouragement and inspiration if you're a gazelle running from a pack of cheetahs or something like that. They're not just going to lay back. We have to assert ourselves, not in a selfish way, but in a sacrificial way of giving. And this is part of what these Thor stories are about. Is it a life and death battle, as the Thor stories are? Would we be snuffed out if we don't assert ourselves? I don't know the answers to those things. I tend to think not. I tend to think that to ask those kinds of questions is to have the wrong perspective. Again, we're looking from the bottom-up kind of perspective, that I believe that there's something in us, in the spirit, that cannot but give of itself in sacrifice, so that the spirit is almost impossible to defeat. And that it isn't a life and death battle, but the love that is in us, when it is in us and it is the propelling thing of us giving ourselves so that we do shine and do give out like the sun, that it is not a minor thing at all. Now we have one other little topic that I want to develop this theme on a little bit. I want to keep it together with what we've been studying in past year. Last year, when we looked at the term Titans, and in the first year of this class, when we talked about Zagreus, we said there was a dual use of the word Titans. In one case, the Titans meant the spiritual beings who exist, or better, subsist, beyond human selfhood. In the other case, the Titans, such as Prometheus, or the Titans that overcame and started eating up Zagreus, represented the Lucifer spirits. This year, very early in the year, we noted that the Northern Europeans also used the word giant to mean Titan. In fact, you can follow etymologies of words to show that Titan and giant are of the same root. We also noted that after the flood of blood at the killing of Ymir, that the giant also took on two meanings. One meant the original frost giants, who are those subsistent, high-order spiritual beings, and the other was like the Lucifers. Now, in the Thor stories, both meanings of Titan or giant hold true, and it's very, very beautiful the way they come out. We've seen that Thor hangs out with the giants in the same way that we have seen that we in spirit hang out with creative beings. In between lies, when we're in the realm of Thor, we revel in creative stuff that gives us the urge to come back to be again as humans. In our ego, that lower self fusion, we associate with the Lucifers. The divine titans or giants need something that we have, and something that we get from the phenomenal worlds, and that is experience. Soul food that the gods need from us our experience. But the Lucifers also need something from us. They need what we get from the physical world, and they want it in the way that they can get it, even though that's detrimental to us. And even though it might even mean our spiritual death, they're willing to delude us magically to get what they want from us. So it is very important that we enter the world, and that we enter the world vigorously, with the full assertion of spiritual will, and with every bit of energy that we have. But we have to do it cleanly. Not with the cling of the Lucifers. We also have to remember that the giants or titans wanted Thor himself. It is true that the higher beings represented by the titans or the giants have completed spiritual being. Hrungnir did have a three-pointed stone heart. He was completed. He was a made god. I don't know how to say it any other way. But they do not have the kind of selfhood or threefoldness that we have, that has been deepened by the threefoldness. Again, we're going all the way back to where it is deepened by an outside point to become the tetrahedron. They don't have that experience that we have. They subsist completely transcendentally. And they need that kind of self that is deepened, that has an objectivity, especially the objectivity that we have in this physical world with a brain-mind. None of the other spiritual hierarchies, all the way up the line, have a brain-mind as we do. As intelligent as the group spirits are, they can't understand our machines. It's foreign to them. And they need our objectivity. The ironic thing is, even the higher spiritual beings, not in a malicious way, will try to overtake our being for their end. And it would be a very high, lofty, divine, spiritual end, but it would be ignorant of our purposes and ignorant of our outlook. I'm not saying that the subsistent super-transcendental beings are out to do us harm, but there might be that effect if we took their ways as our ways in our world. They don't have that objectivity of the kind that we have. The ironic thing about it is the way we keep ourselves is by giving it. Giving it to the divine beings in the Thor style. That way we can have our goats and eat them too. That is by a sacrifice of egoism and a sacrifice of attachment to even our transcendental being is the way that we can give it most cleanly without falling prey to doing it their way. We give ourself, which is us. The experience of us. They wanted Thor. We give ourselves as we are, and that is food in a higher way. Of course, we have to be careful how we dedicate ourselves. The Lucifers want ourselves, and they will give it back to us also. Or they'll take it from us in such a way that we'll still have ourself, but if we do, it'll be a caricature self. The Lucifers always want us to have a false slant on self. They want us to have a virtual self, like a virtual reality, where instead of seeing nature, you see a virtual reality of nature and not nature itself. People who get stuck in the ego of self, in the attachment of self, they become imitations of themselves. And they do caricatures of their own being. Almost like Elvis Presley was doing an Elvis Presley imitation in the latter part of his life. That is having a virtual self. It isn't a spontaneous live self that is discovering by sacrificing everything it knew from the past so that it can see things all brand new again. It has this horrible Luciferian conception of self as somebody that is something, and they try to maintain that attitude all the time. So it's a virtual self. So whether we're looking at the Titans as sublime beyond the world of human spirit beings, or whether we're looking at the Titans as Lucifers, the message is the same. It is, we give of ourself, and we do so in a way that is clean and pure and watchful and wide awake all the way. It isn't something that's passive. We don't have to fight for our existence, but we do have to give. And that giving is not just a passive thing. And that's it. That's why Thor is always battling with the gods, with the giants. I hear a lot of questions coming. And though I won't hear them at this moment, eventually I will. That's usually a sign of believing that there isn't an eternity. It's a sign that those are those that fall into the chasm. What is it called? They fall into the void, or they fall into the pit. It's called different things in different religions. What? The abyss. Yes, that's the most common of them. It's those people who believe that death ends it all. What? I don't know about them. I don't want to talk about specific religions.